Thank you very much. I just wanted to repeat the thanks to everybody who's hung around for this panel. The redistricting community, even among the population of politics geeks, is sort of notoriously insular, and we only get usually that moment in the sun once every 10 years. And otherwise we're sort of back under our rock, maybe studying other things. So it's nice to get a moment in the sun in between those periodic moments of fame and fortune. So I want to talk today about California's experience with redistricting, which, as was just mentioned, it's a new thing in California, and it's unusual nationally. It's not something that has been adopted in a lot of other states yet. So California in 2001 had a redistricting that was what you would call an incumbent protection gerrymander. It was designed, especially the congressional plan, was designed to protect incumbents on both sides. And that produced a modest amount of decline in the state assembly and state senate races, and a significant decline in House races. And there was also, I think, key to the politics that emerged from this was a really limited effort in this plan to try to boost minority representation. In California, minority representation, as you can imagine, it's a very large, very diverse state. That's a big deal. It's an important issue. And I think the outcome of that, not only reducing competition, but also failing to try and make efforts to improve minority representation, it really split the traditional coalitions that had existed around reform. There had been multiple efforts throughout the 1980s in particular in California to try and pass some kind of independent redistricting commission. These efforts were almost always launched by Republicans, and then they immediately got tainted with a partisan lens, right? So what was different this time around is suddenly a lot of activists in minority communities were like, hey, we don't really like these districts either. And they were kind of provisionally on the same side as the Democrats, but as soon as they saw a good opportunity to jump ship, they really did so, and that helped build a new coalition around reform. So there was actually one additional attempt to pass an independent commission. Arnold Schwarzenegger tried to get something through. It ended up getting that same sort of partisan taint to it, and but then there was a follow-on effort which actually passed in 2008 and established this very different system. So the old system was the very traditional system. You had the legislature draw the lines. They drew their own districts, plus what we call the Board of Equalization, which is a 4-member body that deals with tax matters, and nobody has any idea who they are or what they do. And then the congressional districts, and there's quite a number of them in California. This system, as is typical of legislatively drawn districts, has basically zero transparency. If you ever looked at a redistricting bill that comes out of a legislature, it is essentially a list of census blocks. And they don't tell you why they chose those census blocks for this. I mean, so it would be District 1, census block, census block, census block, right? District 2, blah, blah, blah. And they don't tell you why they put one set of blocks in one district versus another. They make no attempt to justify it. There were a few hearings, but not many. Most of the decisions that were made about drawing the districts were made behind closed doors, so it was not a terribly transparent process. The new system, what is called the Citizens Redistricting Commission, was a commission of citizens, so people applied to be on this commission. This is different than Iowa's system. Iowa also has a commission system, as was mentioned, but Iowa's system is there's sort of an analyst's office for the legislature, and every 10 years they become the redistricting people as well. And then, of course, the legislature has to approve it. This is a system where the people who ended up serving came from the general population, maybe a select subset of that population, but nonetheless from the general population. They were chosen by the state auditor's office, which is itself an independent agency. And they were chosen by a very complex set of procedures that was designed to ensure their independence from the political establishment to the extent that it was possible to do it. So you couldn't give more than a certain amount of money to any single candidate. You couldn't be a staffer for a legislator or a member of Congress. You couldn't be a member of Congress or a legislator yourself, obviously. You couldn't have served in office for the last, I think it was 10 years, and you had to agree not to serve in office for the next 10 years after you were done. A lot of rules like that. There were detailed instructions about the goals. So Mike mentioned a lot of the potential goals that you can have in redistricting, compactness and not splitting cities and counties. These kinds of things were explicitly laid out in the law and ranked according to their priorities. So you had to satisfy some first and then others second, and if there was a conflict, you had to resolve the conflict toward the top of the list. And finally, it was a highly transparent system in the sense that they had all of their meetings online. They were actually streamed online. All of their decisions had to be made in public, and they had to justify, and actually to me this is, as I'll mention in a second, this is an important point, they had to justify all of their decisions after they made them. They had to come up with a document that justified them. So what are the arguments for doing it this way? Well, one is just more sensible districts because you've got, compactness, more representative, whatever. More competitiveness. This was an argument that was often made. Higher turnout. People said, oh, it's going to boost turnout in California because people will have all these competitive races. You'd get more moderate representation. This is actually oh my gosh, this isn't going. I'm screwed that up. I am so sorry. I'm just talking and I have a slide. It's like, oh, this California. So I actually have slides that I forgot that this isn't connected. Anyway, got a new Citizens Redistricting Commission. Okay, so we moderate representation. So that the idea that voters would cross party lines to support moderate candidates, and so they'd win more often. That was actually probably the most significant argument for the commission. And then ending the conflict of interest, where legislators drew their own lines. Okay, I got to remember to hit both. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through the evidence that we have so far for how all that stuff turned out. And I'm going to go kind of in the order of the things that were listed in the law that that the commission was supposed to respect. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about competitiveness, which was actually not one of the criteria that they were supposed to consider. So did it have more minority representation? They were required to respond to the needs of the Voting Rights Act very explicitly. The answer is yes, especially Latino representation went up quite a bit. I'm showing sort of, there was a 2001 plan, that's the old one, 2011 draft plan. They came out with a draft in June of 2011, and then they changed it and produced a different plan in August of 2011. And the fact that there was change between the draft and the final indicates that this isn't just about changes in the population of the state. They actually were explicitly drawing lines to produce certain outcomes. And actually produced the very first Asian majority district in California's history. Did it split fewer cities and counties? A little bit. And I think this gets at the idea that even though people tend to focus on the shape of districts, that's actually not necessarily the perfect way to identify a gerrymander. To me, a gerrymander is any district plan that elevates one goal above all others, one or two goals, say. That's not necessarily going to, even if you have a broad diversity of goals, you may end up with some funny shaped districts. And they're going to split cities and counties because people don't live in perfectly shaped boxes and circles, right? So they actually didn't do that much of a better job, but a little bit better. Did it improve the compactness of the districts? Yes. And in a proportional sense, quite significantly. This is just one measure that you can use for compactness. But nonetheless, it didn't produce, again, perfectly compact districts, just better ones than had existed before. And then another thing they were supposed to pay attention to was nesting, which is where you put two assembly districts perfectly within a larger Senate district, because there's 40 Senate seats and 80 assembly seats. And they did a better job there as well, though again, their draft plan did almost a perfect job, and then people were like, what happened to the Latino representation? So then they abandoned it a little bit for the final. Now, did it create more competitive seats? Again, this is not one of the things that they were supposed to do, but the answer is yes, it did a little bit. This is just by party registration. Made a big difference for the House, because again, the House seats were quite obviously an incumbent gerrymander. I'm going to skip over these curves here. Did it produce more open seats? Yes. A bunch of incumbents actually retired, but again, like it did for the House and the Assembly, not really for the Senate, and then it all kind of dropped off. Again, the Senate is sort of the weird outlier. So you saw a disruption when the districts were first used, and then in the 2014, things returned a little bit more to normal. And then incumbents tended to run, and one of the radical changes here was that the district lines were very different. And so incumbents had to move all around. There was a real reshuffling in the political class, and so a lot of incumbents were running in districts that were very different from the ones they had traditionally represented. Races have also been closer, so not just the party registration of the districts, but actual outcomes have been a little closer. Turnout has been a disappointment, right? Because turnout in California is down, not really for presidential races, but in 2014, you can see at the very end here for midterms, we had a really abysmal turnout, but so did a lot of other people. But relative turnout also, if you compare California to other states, we're on sort of a downward path. So we didn't do well in that regard. Now, returning back to these arguments for the commission, I think I should mention that you know, I think probably up to this point I've sounded like something of a booster of this system, and I think I kind of am in the sense that I got convinced. I was quite a skeptic when they were considering this idea, and I was pretty convinced that the outcome was a good one, and it's definitely something worth trying, keep continuing with in California, and then trying in other states in the future. Were the districts more sensible? Yeah, actually they kind of were, like on multiple dimensions. Were the outcomes more competitive? Yeah, they were more competitive. Was turnout higher? No, but I think that was overselling the reform anyway. And I think the one point of caution is that the changes that you're seeing here are relative to the old plan, and that old plan was fairly extreme. You can't imagine that this kind of change is going to emerge in every state that adopts a system like this. But nonetheless, it did produce some positive outcomes. Now, moderate representation, I think, is still sort of an open question. I have a paper I'm working on with Boris Shore at Georgetown, and we've been looking at this with his data, and I've actually found that the answer there is kind of yes. So in contrast to much of political science research, there is some evidence that the redistricting specifically, as opposed to, we also passed a new primary system, the top two primary, and that doesn't seem to have had much effect, but the redistricting, yeah, maybe on the border. Did it end a conflict of interest? I think sort of by definition, because legislators were no longer drawing their own districts, so to the extent that that's important, it's something to keep in mind. And that's it. Thank you very much.